This is Professor Rogers. In this presentation I discuss making tables in APA style. APA style does not dictate the content of tables as much as many people believe, and in practice many of the rules are ignored. As a result, there are a wide variety of tabular forms. What I provide in this presentation are some simple guidelines for tables that, based on my experience, most readers and editors should find acceptable. Thus, everything I say in this presentation might not be strictly APA. In the presentation, we review the structure of the table, different ways in which the body of the table can be used, and the right way to format the table. As an example, we will be using the frequency table of the number of states by region of the country. The N is 51 because the District of Columbia is included. The data was taken from computer-generated output. In APA, tables come after the reference section of the paper. Each table gets its own page. To keep a table from wrapping into the next page, every time additions are made earlier in the paper, create a section break. In Word, go to Page Layout tab, then on the ribbon Breaks, then slide down the menu to Section Next Page. Outside of holding the format of our table steady, a section break allows us to turn the page sideways. Here we see the two pages in Word at the point where the document flows from one page to the next, the second page being the one we created using the section break command. Notice how the second page is wider. The first page uses what is called the portrait orientation, which is the default setting in Word, and the wider page is referred to as the landscape orientation. The orientation command under Page Layout allows for the sideways turn, which is useful if the table is wider than a normal page. However, unless we actually need the wider page, Portal is the preferred orientation for a table. There are a variety of ways to make an APA table in Word. What is important is that regardless the format, the final product must look the same. The approach I show here is typing the table directly into the Word document. I will make some comments about alternative ways to make a table toward the end of the presentation. An APA-style table can be described as a three-line table. The lines segment the table into different parts. There are a couple of ways to make these lines. Here I use the dash key to mimic the old-style typewriter. Word has an automatic format function for lines, so I leave a few spaces at the end, which keeps the automatic format from operating. Another way to make a line is to go to Shapes under Insert in the tabs and grab a line, which can be stretched across the page. I have some people try to use the underline key, but I don't recommend this approach because the line spacing after text above the line does not look attractive. The three lines divide the table into four parts. Above the first line is the title of the table. Between the first and second lines are column headings. After the second line comes the body of the table, or what is sometimes called the table cells. I refer to this section as the guts of the table because it contains the information that we are trying to summarize. Below the bottom line are any notes or footnotes accompanying the table. The title has three lines. The first says how we are reporting results. We are making a table, so we see the word table at the top. If there is more than one table, we would add a number in a numeric format. So if this table were the second table in our paper, we would write Table 2 on the first line. The next line is blank, which can be produced by a blank line or a double space, and the third line contains the title of the table in italics with the major words capitalized. The title should make it clear what the reader is viewing. In this example, my title is Frequency Distribution of States by Region. I personally do not leave a line space between the title and the first line. I should point out that there is a lot of variation in this rule, and there are generally accepted ways to reduce this title section from 3 lines to 1, but I still prefer students use this format because of thesis formatting requirements at my institution. I next jump to the body of the table and add the column headings later once I have the columns set up. I start by labeling the rows of the table. Whatever order of categories you use for the rows should make sense and should make intuitive sense to the readers of your table. When I showed the initial output for region earlier in the presentation, the regions were in alphabetical order, but there is a custom in presenting region data of moving from the right to the left across the map because the eastern seaboard was settled first. I arranged my regions to comply with this expectation. If the data were ordinal, you would arrange the categories from highest to lowest or lowest to highest, even if they came out differently in your initial computer-generated output. Here I have added columns of data for the number of states in each region and the percent that the number represents of the region. Data columns are normally right justified, and I keep the justification constant using tabs. Tabs are placed on the ruler, and the type of tab is selected in the little box at the far left end. Tabs are used usually for two reasons. First, they keep the columns perfectly aligned. Second, they make it easy to change the location of columns if we need to do so. I then add a heading for each column and center the heading appropriately. Again, I use tabs, but I use the tab for center justification, not right justification. I use the letter N for the number of observations, which in this case is the number of states, and I use the symbol for percent over the percent column. I have no notes or footnotes, so I leave the area under the third line blank. I'll show an example of a table with a note in it in a moment. In addition, as a final adjustment, I shorten the length of the 3 lines to be more reflective of the width of the table. The line should be slightly wider than the table information, but not too much wider. Let's look at some formatting issues, including problems I often see in student tables. The table should use the font and font size of the body of the paper, which normally is Times New Roman 12. Students frequently change title formats to accentuate these, or if the table is small, magnify it by changing the font size. These alterations are incorrect. In addition, tables should be double-spaced throughout the table. Large tables present special challenges. One is free to decrease space and font size to make a table fit on a single page. But I never go below font size 8, which in itself is quite small. On the slide here, we see a situation where the table is so big that it rolls onto a second page. Have something on the first page that indicates a multi-page table. In my case, it's the words "continued on the next page" on the bottom of the first page. Also, on the second and any subsequent pages, indicate that the table is a continuation. Here you see the continuation noted on the top of the second page next to Table 1. All line lengths should be the same size, and they should be proportional to the size of the table. On this slide, only the third line at the bottom is correct. Column headers should be aligned with their respective columns. A right alignment or center alignment is appropriate. I personally think that the center alignment looks best, but here is an example of a right alignment and it looks fine. The problem appears when students are either sloppy or they enter data into a table or Excel spreadsheet where it is harder to get alignments correct. Just because you use a table or spreadsheet does not mean you are excused from justifying your headers correctly. A similar problem occurs with justification of columns in the body of the table. Each of the columns in the table shown here is incorrect. The region labels should be left justified. The number column uses a left justification, and the percent column uses a center justification. Both columns of numbers should be right justified along either the ones column or the decimal point. The concept of significant digits is that the same type of number should be rounded to the same decimal place. If I round one number to the ones column, all should be rounded to the ones column. If I round one number to 2 digits, to the right of the decimal point, all should be rounded to 2 digits right of the decimal point. In the example shown here, the n column is correct. All numbers are reported as ones. However, the percent column is incorrect. The percent column does not have to be the same format as the number column, but it must be internally consistent. You'll notice that every number is rounded to one column to the right of the decimal point except for total. Students often think that since the total is exactly 100, they don't need to use significant digits. But the expectation is that they should, even if it is otherwise unnecessary. In this case, 100 should be 100.0 in order to be internally consistent with the column. I've shown here 4 guidelines for using significant digits. The use of significant digits should be consistent internally to a column of data and should also be consistent across columns if the data types are similar. For example, once I decide to report percents one way, I normally would present all percents in the table the same way. I should also be sensible in my calculations. The computer does not generate numbers thinking about significant digits, so you should make cumbersome numbers to be more manageable. Usually rounding to one column to the right of the decimal point is sufficient. Finally, with small samples less than 100, we usually report percents using only whole numbers. The reason for this is that a decimated percentage implies a level of precision that we do not have when we have 100 observations or less. We often have to round numbers to make our tables. The decision of how far to work out our significant digits is one of those examples. Most of us have learned in grade school the number 0.5 always rounds up to the next highest whole number. Rounding can create its own errors in the table. In this example, the total of the column is 100.1%. Obviously, the total is 100%, not 100.1%. This extra tenth of a percent is artificial because it is a product of rounding and is referred to as rounding error. When rounding error occurs in our table, we make a comment about it as a footnote in our table. There are some ways to build a table other than what I show in this presentation. Copying Excel spreadsheets into a paper is often permitted, but the grid line should be turned off and the final product should be appropriately formatted. Some editors may permit the use of copies of computer output. Some editors may not like tabs, which makes table creation miserable. Screenshots are generally not acceptable in an APA table. I've reviewed some common situations, but the list of possible errors is quite lengthy, and we don't have the time to cover every situation. Therefore, let me just say this. Use some common sense. Tables must look good, so if a table looks funny or is hard to interpret, then the table is formatted wrong regardless what the rules are. Also pay attention to what information the reader needs to know. Sometimes we put down a lot of complicated numbers, thinking that we have proved our point with an overwhelming barrage of numbers. But if the reader cannot comprehend what we are doing, then it does not matter how good we are technically. In this presentation, we look at the structure of an APA-style table, different ways to create the table, and formatting considerations. Creating good tables takes experience because so many different situations can be encountered. But what has been discussed here gives a good starting point.